Ladies and gentlemen, our final speaker is a acclaimed broadcaster, writer, author. He has specialized for many years in the unpicking of the misuse of science and statistics, and then become a dedicated campaigner for transparency in clinical trials, a frequent guest on British television and radio, and speaks about bad science wherever he can. Ladies and gentlemen, our final speaker today, Ben Goldacre.
Right, 47 slides in 15 minutes, so you're going to have to pay very, very, very close attention. The last time I spoke at anything like TEDMED, I talked about the problem of clinical trial results being withheld from doctors, researchers, and patients. This is a problem for me, myself, personally, because I am a doctor. And when the results of clinical trials are withheld from us, we cannot make informed decisions about which treatment is best. Now, lots of people have talked to you about the amazing power of science and the power of dreams, and I'm going to talk to you about the power of whining incessantly about the same thing for 2 years. I'm just going to show you the limited progress that we've managed to make on this problem over the course of the past 2 years. So, firstly, very quickly, a recap. So the results of clinical trials are routinely and legally withheld from doctors, researchers, and patients. Reboxetine is a drug which I myself have prescribed. It's an antidepressant. I did all the right things. I looked up in the literature. I found a couple of trials showing reboxetine was better than just as good as any other antidepressant. A couple of trials showing it was better than a placebo. So I happily prescribed this treatment to my patient. It turned out that I was misled. IQWiG, the German equivalent of NICE, only more muscular. I don't know why people smile at that thought. But anyway, IQWiG, the German equivalent of NICE, got into a huge fight with Pfizer, and they said, look, we're only going to look at this if you give us all of the data, all of the trials that have ever been done. And they said no, and there was a big fight, and then finally they got hold of all of it, and they discovered that there were a few trials done showing it was better than a placebo. They were all published, but there were half a dozen trials conducted showing it was worse or no better than placebo, and none of those were published. Similarly, there were a couple of trials published showing it was just as good as any other antidepressant, and they were both published. Meanwhile, 3 times as many patients' worth of data collected showing that it was worse than other antidepressants, and none of that data was published. When you added it all up together, this drug was no better than placebo. So I inflicted harm on my patient, despite doing everything that you are supposed to do, despite the fact that nobody broke any laws. I inflicted harm on my patient not just because I gave them something which is ineffective and unnecessarily exposed them to side effects, but also, crucially, I inflicted harm on my patient because I could have given them another treatment. They were deprived of another effective treatment because I gave one which, if I had known all of the information at the time, I would not have prescribed. How commonly does this happen? Well, it turns out, alarmingly commonly, this is a study which took all the FDA trials, and that's not all the trials that have ever been done on these antidepressants, but it's all the trials available to the regulator. It was a huge piece of work. It was a huge piece of administrative hassle getting hold of all of this data. And when they finally got hold of it all, they added up. They found 38 trials with positive results, 36 trials with negative results, and then they compared that against what was published in the academic literature, and you can see 38 positive results turns into 48 positive results, which is extraordinary. How do you do that? Well, if you torture the data for long enough, it will confess to anything. But 36 negative results turned into 3 negative results. So where did all the trials with negative results go? Well, it turns out, this is extremely common, there have been dozens of studies done on this. It turns out, if you add them all up together, probably roughly around 50-50, the chances of a trial that's completed actually going on to being published. Trials with positive results are about twice as likely to be published as trials with negative results. This is research misconduct, but it's research misconduct on a scale that we don't really feel in our belly. If you deleted half the data points from any one trial in order to make it have the results more like how you think it ought to be, like if you were in your GCSE science project, if you deleted half the data points to make the line on the graph go a bit more like how you think it ought to, we would all fully recognize that that was research misconduct. And yet, when people delete half of the whole studies from the research literature, for some reason, a kind of cultural blind spot, we never saw that as research misconduct. So, the first thing that happens when you talk about all of this is people say, oh, this has all been fixed. And that's not true, but they rely on various fake fixes. Firstly, they say, oh, trials now have to be registered before they can be published in academic journals. That's true. The ICMJE, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, said we're not going to publish anything unless it's been properly registered. And everybody said the problem's been fixed forever, but there was no audit to see if they actually complied with that. And when an audit was finally done, it turns out between 1/4 and 1/2 of all the trials that they publish are still unregistered. Secondly, there was a piece of legislation, the Fda Amendment Act 2007, which said that all trials, with at least one site in the US on a currently available drug, have have to post their results on clinicaltrials.gov within 12 months of completion. So again, everybody said, oh, this is fantastic, the problem's been fixed forever. But again, no routine audit. And when an audit was finally done in 2012, published in the British Medical Journal, it turned out that the rate of compliance with this legislation, which everybody said had fixed the problem forever, the rate of compliance with this legislation was 22%. If you go to regulators to ask them for data, you get stuff like this. I know, it's weird. People sort of laugh. It's an immediate, obvious, visceral response. The person in the European Medicines Agency, as they were stuffing that in the envelope, must have thought, something's wrong here. Now, interestingly, in 2010, after a 3.5-year-long battle, the European Ombudsman gave a damning ruling of maladministration against the European Medicines Agency and forced them to start releasing their clinical study reports. These are very long, very detailed documents that give you much, much more information about the full methods and results of clinical trials. And that's how the Tamiflu scandal began to develop, because people began to look in more detail at the methods of the trials, and they discovered what we all know, what we already know in medicine, which is that not all trials are necessarily fair tests of a treatment. For example, in the case of Tamiflu, some trials which were described as double-blind, where neither the doctor nor the patient is supposed to be able to distinguish between the treatments, actually the pills were different colors. For example, some of the case ascertainment, basically, do you have pneumonia or not, was done not by chest X-ray, not by a diagnostic algorithm, but by patient self-report. Pneumonia is not a disease which you would classically have expected to be reported by patient self-report. So access to this full methods and results really, really matters. Now, what happened next? Because that whinging I did 2 years ago, kind of here. So, firstly, I did a book. I whinged about it for 400 pages. You should consider yourself very lucky that you weren't there for that. And lots of people popped up and said, oh, this is all long documented, long historical. Trial results are published on websites like clinicaltrials.gov with a compliance rate of 22%. So, I guess, so the thing that happens quite commonly in medicine is that you feel very despondent. And what we normally do when we feel despondent is we fall back on rules. We fall back on things like quality improvement frameworks and audit and teamwork. And so it kind of occurred to me that that was the right thing to do here. Just very simply, what have you done before? Did it work? Who's trying to stop you? What went wrong? What could you try instead? And how would you measure? How would you know if you did any better? So the first thing was federation. This is Sarah Wollaston. She's a GP who's now an MP, and she began asking questions in Parliament. In the morning, when she asked her question in Parliament, saying this is a really big, important problem, we need to sort this out, we need to make sure that all trial results are reported in full, Earl Howe, who's the health minister responsible for the pharmaceutical industry, gave a quote to the Today programme saying this problem just doesn't exist. Trials are already reported. By the time the question was formally asked at 11 o'clock in the morning in Parliament, after, I presume, a series of please don't embarrass yourself, Minister emails, the formal response was, yes, I recognise that this is an important problem, and I'm glad that people like Dr. Goldacre are raising it, and I would be very happy to have a meeting to arrange to discuss talking about how we can fix it. So that's what happened. That's us on the right. That's what happens if I wear a suit. It's no more plausible. Just next to me, that's Ian Chalmers. He's the founder of the Cochrane Collaboration, the global collaboration of 14,000 academics who produce systematic reviews. He's so awesome that he's a knight, and he's such an awesome knight that he did a randomized trial to see if it was worth being a knight. Seriously, there's this terrible thing in medicine called knight starvation syndrome, where senior doctors do terrible things to try and get knighthoods. And they often say, oh, it's because I'd get more influence. It's not for me, it's for rheumatoid arthritis as a whole. And he wanted to see if this was true, so he divided all his outgoing posts in half, and half of it was signed Sir Ian Chalmers, and half of it was signed Ian Chalmers. And then he measured the speed with which people replied, and there was no difference, and he published it. It's a trial with negative result. It's called Yes Sir, No Sir, Not Much Difference, Sir, Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine. Anyway, so he keeps it real. And that's Fiona Godley, editor of the BMJ, and Carl Hennigan, who's professor of evidence-based medicine at Oxford. And we went, and we saw him, and there were lots of promises, but it felt like this was all going to fizzle out. And at the same time, I was getting all kinds of strange smears from industry who were saying things like, he's a fringe maverick, nobody really takes him very seriously, he's got bad hair and wears silly shoes. So we realized that federation was the key. So we began to get together a letter. So we did all the normal, boring, early, pompous things like a letter to the Times, which you can't see. You don't want to see it. It's like a letter to the Times. And then lots of editorials happened in lots of academic journals, and then we started getting things like the Health Select Committee said, this is a real problem, we need to fix this. The Public Accounts Committee said, hey, this is a real problem, we need to fix this. Put out a formal report saying this is an absolute disaster. It was supposed to be looking just at Tamiflu, but their final report said, we were astonished to discover that the results of clinical trials are being routinely and legally withheld from doctors, researchers, and patients. We spent $500 million on Tamiflu, but that's obviously just the tip of the iceberg. The Science and Technology Select Committee put out a thing saying they were going to do a report, and now they've done their report, and their report says this is a problem, and we need to fix it. And so then we formed the All Trials campaign, and the All Trials campaign calls for 3 very simple things. We ask for all trials to be registered with their full methods and results reported, and the clinical study report, that very long and detailed document, should be made available where one has been created. When we launched, the head of the ABPI, this chap here, he's like our pantomime bad guy for today, although there are many to choose from, he said, we will not respond to PR-driven initiatives like the All Trials campaign. That was in February 2013. In November 2013, up against me on Newsnight, he said, I've never said that. So what is it that made Stephen Whitehead change his mind? Well, I cannot know the heart of Stephen Whitehead, but I think it may have something to do with this. The All Trials campaign now has the support of pretty much the entire medical, academic, and patient group establishment in the UK and increasingly in Europe. 80 patient groups signed up in one day. We now have the support of over 100 patient groups representing over 15 million patients. We are supported by all of the medical and academic professional bodies that matter, not just in the UK, but increasingly in Europe and in the US. And we've also got the support of many in industry, including GSK, biggest drug company in the UK, one of the biggest drug companies in the world, who've made a firm commitment to share all clinical study reports going back to the beginning of that company. So now we find something more interesting. Because now the story stops being, there are all these people who are bad. There's this problem that's being ignored. Now the story becomes, how do you keep a juggernaut moving? And how do you deal with the fact that some people in industry are able to show leadership, and meanwhile, at the other end, you've got some horrible stuff happening. For example, AbbVie and Intermune, 2 drug companies, sued the European Medicines Agency and the Central Court of Justice and stopped them releasing clinical study reports. So this brief window of transparency where we could get access to the clinical study reports that the European Medicines Agency holds, which is not all of the clinical study reports on all of the medicines that have been used today, but it is at least a reasonably useful subset, somewhere to start. That was shut down by these 2 companies. That slide is for when I'm talking in a different situation and I can speak more freely. But at the same time, Johnson & Johnson is sharing clinical trial results. There's clinical study data requests, which is lots of companies all pooling their things and saying they can do. Does anybody have a watch? How long have I been talking for? Hang on. I've got 7 minutes and 38 seconds. We better get going. So, right. Now, lots and lots of interesting industry initiatives. So FPR and Pharma, the 2 pharmaceutical industry bodies for Europe and for America, who both fully supported AbbVie and Intermune, suing the European Medicines Agency to prevent them releasing clinical study reports, put out this extraordinary document. And this is where things kind of get interesting and techy and nerdy and complicated and difficult. Because now you have to start dealing with interesting loopholes in industry promises. So industry promises go back a long way. We've got a long tradition of people making promises that then turn out to be riddled with loopholes or are subsequently ignored. The key loophole with the Fda Amendment Act 2007 and also with the promises made here is that they are prospective and not retrospective. Now, it sounds great. If you say we're going to share all of the clinical trial methods and results for all the trials starting from now, you kind of think, oh, that's great, because people are being transparent starting from now. But the problem is, quite a lot of you are doctors, is that right? So put up your hand if you're a doctor and you only prescribe drugs which came on the market after January 2013. 85% of all prescriptions in the UK are for generic medications which came on the market more than 10 years ago. So the era of methods and results that we require in order to practice medicine safely and effectively, we need the trial results on the medicines that we're using today. And those are the trials that were done 2, 5, 10, and 20 years ago. because we use the treatments from 2, 5, 10, and 20 years ago. We're not trying to rake over old ground. We're not trying to humiliate or embarrass anybody. I actually think that the reputational and legal consequences of becoming transparent on the medicines that we use today are much less than industry thinks. But we do need that information in order to practice medicine safely. To be fair, that's not really the only problem with this. It also said that you have to apply to an independent data committee, but all the examples of independent data committees are just stuffed full of people who work for those companies anyway. Oh, and they say you have to go through their application process to get access to the protocol. The protocol is a secret. Anyway. Next, some slightly graceless behavior here. This is FPA and Pharma. We happen to get hold of an extraordinary internal memo sent to all of the bigwigs and all of the big drug companies in the world in which they talked about their advocacy strategy against transparency, which is kind of an interesting thing to have. And key among that was, the top bullet point under advocacy was mobilize patient groups to raise concerns about transparency. Isn't that interesting? So nice Guardian headlines and lots and lots of people being very critical. Then this slightly disappointing document with a happy ending. This is the Ethical Standards in Health and Life Sciences Group, which is an organization set up supposedly to help get kind of good, clear guidelines for better collaboration between industry and doctors. And that's a really, really good thing, right? I'm in no sense anti-industry. I just think that there are imperfections in medicine that we need to fix. We need to make sure that we practice evidence-based medicine as perfectly as possible. But industry and doctors collaborating is incredibly positive, incredibly valuable, incredibly important thing. But we have to go into it with our eyes open, recognize that sometimes our interests are aligned and sometimes our interests are misaligned. And crucially, we have to have clear guidelines, because not every doctor is going to bore themselves to death by reading about all the problems in industry. So the Ethical Standards in Health and Life Sciences Group was supposed to do this. Unfortunately, it turns out to be one of the clearest examples of industry capture you could possibly hope to see. They produce documents which make a series of statements which are entirely false about some of the most important issues in medicine today. Specifically, they say industry about industry-sponsored trials is publicly available. That's just not true. I suppose it's true if you say, well, strictly speaking, a little bit of information about some industry-sponsored trials is publicly available. They go further. They say there's a robust regulatory framework governing disclosure of clinical trial information. Where is this? We wrote to them, we asked them, we said, look, what are you even talking about? There's no legislation at all in Europe. Where is this robust? No answer. The fact that it's impossible to get new medicines approved or data published in top medical journals without prospective disclosure of clinical trial information on approved, again, completely untrue. So we got them shut down. That's nice. Next, so more things, European legislation, nice, great, like one of those really difficult things if you're kind of running a campaign where something happens that's quite good and you want to say that's really great, but at the same time, you have to point out the loopholes. So Glenis Willmott is a Labour MEP who did fantastic work in the European Parliament as the rapporteur on the new clinical trials regulation. And she managed to get through some clear safeguards, which means that all trials in Europe, conducted within Europe, starting from like a little while from now, will have to share their methods and results. Now that's great. Again, that's great. But hands up who uses drugs that came on the market only after January 2015. The speed with which old drugs are replaced by new drugs is extremely slow, and rightly so. Because it's really kind of exciting to talk and think about innovation. But we have to be realistic. There's an extraordinary systematic review published about 6 months ago by Cochrane, which looks at one very, very simple question. In a head-to-head test between the new treatment and the old treatment, how often does the new treatment win? This is a really interesting metric on because everybody assumes new means good. And the answer is it's just over 50-50. It's about 51 to 49. Your chances of dying as a middle-aged man have roughly halved over the last 3 decades, but that's not because of any single amazing epoch-making breakthrough. It's because of a gradual accumulation of tiny, tiny incremental risks and benefits that, when added together, are fantastic. But each individual one is often very difficult to detect, and that's why we do randomized controlled trials. We don't rely in medicine on, well, they came and saw me and they were pretty unwell and I gave them a pill, and then they came back a week later and they looked pretty good, so I reckon this stuff works, right? We don't rely on even observational data. We do randomized controlled trials. They cost about $10,000 a patient. Each individual trial costs millions of dollars. And we do these trials because we want to exclude all forms of bias. We want to get the most accurate possible picture of the true risks and benefits of a treatment. And we have to control for statistical noise and everything so brilliantly, so carefully, because we're often trying to detect very modest changes in the risks and the benefits of new treatments. And it is extraordinary. It makes no sense that after spending millions of dollars on each individual trial in order to perfectly exclude bias, in order to detect those tiny benefits, that we then allow all of those biases to flood back in by allowing up to half of all clinical trial results to be withheld from doctors, researchers, and patients. The thing that I find really kind of disturbing about talking about this more than anything else is when people suggest that it's somehow radical as a notion, the idea that we should share the results of all trials. And it's not. Industry doesn't benefit from withholding the results of clinical trials. The reputational consequences are absolutely catastrophic, and we're doing our best to make them worse. The impact on patient care is entirely unacceptable, and we're doing our best to fix it. If you're an individual, come to our site and sign up. If you run a company, come to our site and sign up. Send us your logo. Be proud. Say that you are able to show leadership where others before you are failing. Thank you very much.